The world is old and the powers are weary. The god at the door of night has fallen, and the great enemy of the world has come back from the timeless void. The shadow has awakened the great evils to regain dominion over Ardar. Darkness shall cover the land, if not with the deeds of a small fellowship of elf friends. Join the players of this Dungeons & Dragons campaign as they fulfill the events of the Dag or Daggeroth prophecy and strive with Morgoth on the plains of Valinor. Welcome to the Undying Lands in Part 3 of the Inglorion Bastards trilogy, Trials of the Valar.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to episode 140 of the Inglorion Bastards podcast. With me tonight, I have probably the last Tolkien scholar that I'll interview for the run of the for the trilogy. So it's both a happy night because you guys know how much I look forward to these, and kind of a sad night because I'm thinking back to all the great interviews that we've done and how much I've learned, and how really one interview kind of leads to other interviews. And it's once you start going down that rabbit hole, it's hard to stop. But let me tell you about the person I have with me tonight. So he has worked for both TSR and Wizards of the Coast on Dungeons and Dragons. He's a scholar specializing in J.R.R. Tolkien, and you all probably have heard of his book, A History of the Hobbit. And that is not his only book, but I would like to welcome to the podcast tonight, John Rateliff.
Thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here.
And John, when we were chatting via email when we were setting this up, I meant when I said I can't believe you're my sort of final interview with your interest in D&D and Tolkien. I figured you would have been first on my list, but I'm just so happy to have you here. But I want to get right into this. I know that you started studying Tolkien. And you ended up moving to Wisconsin to study at Marquette, because there's a great sort of Tolkien library there. Is that right? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That's right. I'm originally from Arkansas. I was finishing up my master's and was looking around to apply for a PhD. And there are two places in America that have Tolkien collections. There's Wheaton College and there's Marquette University. And Wheaton College doesn't have a graduate program. So that's why I applied to Marquette, moved to Wisconsin so that I could work on the manuscripts in my spare time. What's surprising is I'm not the only person who's done this kind of thing, because when I got there, I found a guy named Tom Santosky had just moved from Scranton to Milwaukee. On his way to California, he'd stopped in Milwaukee and looked at the Marquette manuscripts and never got further than Milwaukee. He spent the next 12 years there in Milwaukee working with the manuscripts.
Wow, I don't blame him. And so, how long were you there?
I was there from 1981 to 1990, so almost a decade.
And you got your degree there?
I got my PhD there, which I like to call a PhD in fantasy. Actually, they didn't let you do dissertations on Tolkien in those days, but they would let you do a dissertation on, say, Lord Dunsany, the Irish writer, because he wrote for the Abbey Theatre. The fact he was one of the great science fantasy short story writers was sort of not in the official account of literature in the canon. So I got to write on Lord Dunsany, who was one of Tolkien's favorite fantasy writers.
Oh, wow.
He's the first person to come up with his own fantasy pantheon.
Really?
Nobody had ever come up with a pantheon of fantasy gods before Lord Dunsany. So he's a huge influence on Lovecraft, Tolkien, and everybody else.
Everybody else, including Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Including Dungeons and Dragons. Dunsany is right there in the background.
Huh. Well, so can you tell us a little bit about the collection there? Like, can you put a picture in our minds?
It is an amazing collection that they bought it from Tolkien in the 1950s. About 7,000 pages of draft typescript proofs, corrected proofs. Just a huge collection, which was sort of roughly sorted into, this is book 1, this is book 2, this is book 3. In the 70s, they went through and did a very close count of every page. So they sort of assigned every page a number. But it turned out that when Tolkien had packed up the box of manuscripts and sent it to Milwaukee, he had accidentally left out some. And his son was working on the history of Middle-earth and had just decided he was going to have to deal with with the Lord of the Rings. And so he went through all the manuscripts he had, which turned out to be about 3,000 pages. Marquette took all the manuscripts it had, which was about 7,000 pages, and Tom and I and the archives and Christopher sorted out the sequence in which all these pages went if they were interwoven.
Oh, wow.
Tom Santosky worked that out with Christopher Tolkien. It was a huge undertaking. This draft that Christopher had led to this draft which Marquette had was a revised draft, but then Christopher had the typescript, and then Marquette had the revised typescript. Sometimes it was that complicated.
Wow. And so, I mean, did you get to interact with Christopher?
He was doing it all by postage at that point.
Okay.
But he did, as he was wrapping up the project, decided he wanted to come to Milwaukee and see the manuscripts for himself. So they held a conference here in 1987, the Marquette MythCon, and Christopher Tolkien was the guest of honor. He came and gave a talk in which he read an unknown piece of his father's called the 1960 Hobbit, which is now published in the history of the Hobbit. I got to print it, but it was completely unknown when Christopher came and read it out loud.
Do you mind if we? That's a good segue into talking about your book here, which is, let me tell you, the version that I have is called A Brief History of the Hobbit, and this is 600 pages of wonderfulness. And you mentioned kind of a little bit about the manuscript that Christopher read a piece of, but I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about sort of the evolution of the history of the Hobbit.
Sure. There are 3 different versions. There's the original History of the Hobbit, which is a 2-volume hardcover. I got the chance to add some extra material into it for revised edition, so that's the complete History of the Hobbit, which is about 1,000 pages, 1 volume. And then I got to do an abridgment of it for people who wanted a little less than that, and that's called The Brief History. It's only about 600 pages. When I was abridging it, I cut down a lot of my commentary. I kept as much Tolkien as possible and reduced the Rateliff, because I thought anybody picking this up is picking it up for the Tolkien. The Rateliff is there to make it look a little easier to follow, a little more smoother.
Oh, well, I can tell you from what I've read so far, I don't mind the Rateliff.
Thank you.
You got it. So tell us more.
It's basically arranged using Christopher Tolkien's History of Middle-earth as a model. You get the manuscript followed by some textual notes followed by some commentary. You start with the earliest manuscript, then you give the next version and the next version. So the History of the Hobbit begins with the 6 pages we have left from the first handwritten draft of the first chapter of the book. I call that phase 1, the Prifton fragment. Mm-hmm. Because we're missing like the first 6 or 8 pages out of that chapter. What we have is the second half of the chapter. But before that was lost, he made a typescript, and I called that the Bledorthan typescript. And it's 12 pages long and covers the opening of the story as well as a revised version of the fragment. Mm-hmm. And then we have what I called phase 3, which is where he starts the main manuscript. It goes all the way from page 13 to page 167. It's most of the book in one big long chunk. It actually starts in the middle of a sentence at the end of the typescript. So you have 12 pages of typescript. It breaks off in the middle of a sentence. First word of what would be the next word of that sentence is the first word of the manuscript that follows. He got all the way to the scene at Ravens, where they're talking to the ravens, wondering what has become of Smaug. And he stopped at that point and went back and made a typescript of the whole thing so other people could actually read it. And then he wrote a quick conclusion, the last 4 or 5 chapters, all in one go. And that's pretty much how he wrote The Hobbit.
It's really cool to read about, specifically like... I'm at the point, or I just passed the point where there's just they're talking about sort of that first like seminal line, right? Like in a hole in the ground, and talking about sort of like all of the different references about his recollection of writing that piece. Do you remember? Do you
Yes,
remember the section I'm talking about?
and that's become even more complicated. About 2 years ago, a new version of the origin of the Hobbit showed up in a diary from his 13-year-old son, and it suggests that I got it wrong. That the Tolkien actually started it in 28 or 29, not 1930 or 31.
Really?
So the fun never ends. Even with
Ah,
something as you think as many people have pored over the evidence as carefully, still something new can come out as late as the fall of 2018. New piece of evidence, which is absolutely authentic, absolutely contemporary, and blows the old evidence out of the water.
huh.
That
What?
thing can happen even after 80 years.
Well, I think like how many times I've sat down and tried to write a story and I tried to rewrite a story and we're talking, one or two attempts. And if somebody had to ask me, hey, when did you write that? I would have no idea. Can you imagine asking someone like Tolkien or people in Tolkien's life, like, hey, when did he write that? He wrote and rewrote these things over and over
Yes.
again. Trying to pinpoint that must be so difficult.
He's an extremely conscientious author in that he's willing to rewrite it as many times as it takes to get it just the way he wants it. He doesn't draft things off and then he's done. C.S. Lewis was great at he would think of something, he would write it out, he'd revise it, he was done.
Yeah. Yeah.
He never went back and did revised versions of his book, or very rarely. Tolkien goes over and over and over. But it gets better and better and better. It's worth the work.
Well, so we recently, I'm in just going through this. One of my favorite things to read are authors' acknowledgments. And I noticed in your acknowledgement, you mentioned Doug Anderson. Well,
Yes.
we actually just interviewed Doug. And so could you tell us, did you get a chance to sort of correspond with Doug in the process of writing this?
Yes. To back up a little bit, at about 1986, Christopher was just deciding that he was going to have to deal with the Lord of the Rings in the history of Middle Earth. But he didn't want to deal with the Hobbit, which he thought was really sort of a side thing. It wasn't really part of the Legendarium. But he had several people who wanted to work on the Hobbit. Doug Anderson had started a project on the Hobbit, Tom Santusky and myself. So basically we got together with Christopher, and what the agreement we worked out is Doug would continue work on his project, which is what became the Annotated Hobbit, which I highly recommend if you haven't seen the Annotated Hobbit. It's a really good book. Tom and I collaborated on an edition of the Hobbit manuscript, and it got complicated. I had to drop out because it turns out you can't co-edit a book and write a dissertation at the same time. Not if you're me, anyway. You have to do one or the other.
Sure.
Tom wound up being the sole writer on that, but then he got ill and couldn't finish it. So he asked if I would finish it. So after he was gone, I went back and basically started over and did it as a sort of like a one-man show.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm afraid it was complicated, but that was how it worked out. Doug specifically started with the first published text of the first printing of the first edition and worked forward from there of everything that had been revised and changed. I basically worked up to the point of publication, starting with the beginning of the writing and ending with publication. So I viewed our books as complementary, that his covered the whole history of post-publication and mine the history up to that point. And it was a great relief that there were a lot of things I didn't have to deal with because Doug had already done them. And there were things that Doug didn't have to deal with because I was covering that as well.
So, did you in the process of writing this and sort of being at Marquette, did you bump into anybody else? Any other sort of notable Tolkien scholars? And the reason I ask is I got a chance to interview Karen Wynne Fonstad's son.
I saw that
Mark.
podcast. I went and looked that one up. That was a very
Yeah.
good one.
Yeah. I mean, he and his father are very sweet people. I talked to them for probably over a year before I got a chance to interview them, and he mentioned in the interview that his mother at night would spend a lot of time on sort of her atlas, and she'd drive down to Marquette because they didn't live too far away from there at the time. So I was wondering, did over the course of sort of writing this and studying at Marquette, did you get a chance to bump into anybody that the listeners might know?
I really did. Speaking of Fonstad herself, I didn't know her well, but I did get to meet her at the '83 conference.
Wow.
I saw her in Wisconsin not too long after that, and she was sort of debating, where do you go from doing a history of Atlas of Middle Earth, and I suggested she get in touch with the people at TSR, because that seemed to me to be a really good fit. That they needed people to do high quality maps of fantasy worlds, and she had the skills to do high quality maps of fantasy worlds.
So you connected her with TSR.
I certainly recommended she contact them. I don't know if that had
Wow.
if that was just a confirmation or something, or if that led her to it, but they pushed her to give it a try, and she must have, because we do have the books she did for TSR, and they're very good. I got to know Richard West at Madison and Jared Lobdell. Got to know Verlin Flieger when she came to use the manuscripts. Mike Foster, Wayne Hammond came out for that 83 conference. Wayne and Christina both interviewed separately or together. Is definitely worth your while.
Yeah.
They know, well, you can look at their chronology and you can basically play the game of what was Tolkien doing 100 years ago today.
Well, can I ask, you mentioned TSR, and this seems like a good segue to talking about some of the work that you've done for our beloved Dungeons and Dragons. So you worked both for TSR and Wizards of the Coast, is that
and
correct?
Hasbro, all three.
Wow.
I think I'm the only person to have been laid off by all three companies.
That's great.
But I was there for 10 years all told. Between the time spent at each of those three, it adds up to a little over 10 years.
Oh wow! So did you get to interact with like Gary or what's the other gentleman who started it? Ron Arneson. Yeah, exactly.
Not really. They were sort of in the past by the time I got there. I got there in 91, not long after finishing up my degree at Marquette. But I did get to meet both men. I met Guy Gax at Winter Fantasy when I saw he was running a playtest of his new game, Legendary Adventures. I thought a chance to play a game with Guy Gax as the DM, you don't pass up something like that.
No way.
It turned out it was Guy Gax's DM, his 8-year-old son, and I were the entirety of the playtest. So I kind of took a supporting role, and he devoted letting the kid have a lot of fun. And, it was fun. It was worth doing.
If I'm not mistaken, didn't Gary Gygax wasn't the origins of Dungeons and Dragons kind of with Gary and his kids?
Yeah, it's two different strands came together. One was Arneson playing more games in Minneapolis area. The other was Gygax running all kinds of games in Lake Geneva. And when Gygax sort of heard about Arneson's thing, they got together. The way I like to describe it is that Arneson had the idea and Gygax kind of figured out how to make a game other people could play. And it wouldn't have happened without the both of them. I did get to meet Arneson a few years later, that he was out at Wizards of the Coast when they were starting on 3rd edition. They brought him in as a consultant, and he was very pleased by that. I don't think he actually wound up writing any of 3rd edition, but he was, it was kind of classy of them to ask after all that years, do you have anything you want to say?
Absolutely. So speaking of 3rd edition, am I right to think that you did some writing for 2nd and 3rd edition?
Yes, I was the co-editor of both the Player Handbook and the DMG, which are the 2 of the 3 core books for 3rd edition, and for most of the whole D20 system. D20 system does derive from the 3rd edition rule books.
Mm-hmm.
But I also got to work on a lot of other stuff. The Night Below box set, Return to the Tomb of Horrors, Return to Keep of the Borderlands.
Oh, wow.
Mark of Amber, The Reverse Dungeon. There were quite a few. I was really grateful to get the chance to edit and to design. I guess by the time I was done at TSR and Wizards, I'd worked at some point in just about every game world they had.
And you yourself are a role player still?
Oh, yes.
Or
in a Call of Cthulhu campaign every Saturday night, and old style D&D campaign every Monday night.
Yeah, well, that's how I came to it. The original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and the original Oriental Adventures and all of those. If you can picture those books.
Oh yes, I don't have to imagine because they're here in front of me and to my side in my office. And all the modules to the left, all the rule books above that, all the box sets across from me and all the third edition stuff to the right of that.
Well, can I ask, do you have a favorite campaign setting? Fifth edition sort of is all about sort of Forgotten Realms.
I'm a bit of an iconoclast, is that my favorite is not the generated campaign worlds, but campaign worlds that people make up for themselves.
I see.
Of all the published worlds, I think Ravenloft is my favorite.
Oh yeah.
Though I certainly thought Al-Qadim and Mystara were awfully good as well.
Well, we could. I was going to say we could probably just talk Dungeons and Dragons for forever, but
I'd be fine with that. But
yeah. Well, I wanted to ask. So your name came up originally, probably 3 or 4 or 5 months ago, when I was talking with Verlin Flieger, and how it came up was I have a book that I believe you put together for her called A Wilderness of Dragons.
yes, that's a
Could you?
picture for Verlin.
Yeah, can you talk about how sort of that came to be?
Sure. There's in scholarship. Used to be a thing called a festschrift, in which people would gather together and contribute essays in honor of somebody, usually someone who had been in the field a long time, who had mentored them, who had been their teacher. And the idea holds that there's some people you just want to show this person's really important. This person has been an inspiration to other people. Here's a book in his or her honor.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought Verlin deserved that. So I got talked to people, and people contributed essays, and I edited them, and we got it published. We thought The Wilderness of Dragons was just a nice name. It comes out of one of Tolkien's essays.
I wondered if it was a quote of something. Well, I'm sure that this is like a traditional thing, but for her specifically, the kinds of essays that you have in A Wilderness of Dragon just fit Verlin so well, because her essays are just so interesting and so witty.
I was really pleased that there was a nice variety of various things that she's worked on. People doing essays, drawing on her work and developing her work. And there was even some on her fiction, which made a nice little sort of part at the end.
I want to transition, if I could, now. So,
okay,
we've talked a little bit about Tolkien and a little bit about D&D. What we haven't talked about too much is sort of the storyline for my campaign, and that's kind of how this all came to be, right? It's a group of friends and I got together and I put together this trilogy, which wasn't going to be a trilogy at first. We were just playing the Adventures in Middle Earth rule set from Cubicle 7. So we played through sort of Middle Earth proper, and about halfway through that campaign, I was like, you know what, there's more to this story. And so moving forward in time, the storyline took them to, the Lonely Isle, to Toleracea, and then finally to, Amon, Valinor area. And so for me, it was really cool because I got to kind of work backwards in time, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
For me, that's the most interesting part, right? The Silmarillion sort of time frame. So your episode here is going to air, I think, probably around July 20th, 2020. And right around that time, the characters are doing what I'm referring to as trials of the Valar. These tasks that the Valar, who sort of at the end of days are weak and weary, have tasked these adventurers to do these things to bring about the last battle. And one of the things that I have them kind of hopping around all over the place doing these trials, the characters, and they end up at Mount Gundabad. And in sort of my planning, I had imagined the birthplace of Durin, right? Not the birthplace, but the awakening point of
right.
Durin the Deathless, and that I had imagined some sort of like tribute shrine that the dwarves had created and hidden away, that the orcs couldn't find, and so they show up there. And one of my characters, whose name is Burin, and I don't know if you know anything about sort of
appears in the draft of Council of Elrond.
Yes, very good. Oh, very good. Yeah. So exactly.
That's a great name.
It's a great name, and he originally he had written, and he didn't follow through with this obviously, but Burin is mentioned where you just mentioned him, but he was also mentioned as a possible son to Balin, and he had abandoned that.
I had forgotten that.
And so kind of Burin thinks that he is the son of Balin, sort of going through the first part of the campaign, even in like the second part of my trilogy, and he learns that he's actually just adopted, and that his true lineage puts him in sort of kind of the Dane sort of family tree, which puts him in line to be the seventh incarnation of Durin the Deathless, right? So, and so I refer to this as here's the quote that I used in the campaign: "A hero of mixed blood and lost heritage will rise and rekindle the forge of Durin. He will be seventh in line and seventh in number with the wakened lords of old. They are the last children of Aule and will serve him and aid him in the remaking of Arda after the last battle." So I was wondering if there's, if you've spent any time thinking about, during the Deathless and the seven incarnations, or if you'd like to add anything to that. Generally what we do here on the podcast is I'll throw out something from the campaign, and people like, Mike Trout and Corey and Verlin, they'll all kind of, pick it apart and say, oh, well, that's plausible. A lot of times what the scholars end up saying are, well, it's Tolkien, of course it's possible, right? Like he didn't flush that out. So but I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add to this part.
I'm curious if in this reconstruction, if Burin would have been defending the Lonely Mountain.
Yeah,
It seems
yeah.
to be likely of the likeliest place for him to have been between the Council of Elrond and the end of the age. At the end of the Third Age, when they hear that Dane has died in battle,
Oh, yeah. I guess.
Burin must have been with him
Yeah, I mean, so
to take over the lordship of Durin's folk.
yeah. Well, so I think if that is the case, and that makes a lot of sense, then that's, I think, a flaw in my story planning.
Ah,
I think what I was trying to plan for Burin was, originally I think they eventually want to take back Khazad Dûn, right?
right.
They sort of they want to, because that's kind of their place, right? That's where their people are, and or should be. And so I was kind of his job after the last battle was to sort of, bring all the tribes together of what's left of the dwarves, help to remake, to fix the damage caused by this last battle, and to sort of retake Moria or Khazad Dûm. But you're right, that would make a lot of sense, and that seems like a flaw in
If
my
you're
planning.
the Dagorleth, then everything's off the table because that's the battle of battles.
I think that's all the questions I have for you, except for, of course, the thing that everybody's going to sort of want to know about, and that's anything that you have going on right now, anything that you're excited about that you'd like to talk about. I notice on your website you have a section for sort of forthcoming work. So anything like that you want to talk about?
Actually, I'm working on a big project that I've been working on for several years that I'm pretty excited about. I mentioned the Marquette manuscripts. They have this large amount of material that came from Tolkien in the 50s, and another large amount of material that came from Christopher Tolkien in the 80s. They've never fully integrated those manuscripts.
Hmm.
And what they're doing now is they have created electronic scans of every page of every manuscript. High quality electronic scans that you can click on and enlarge the page or rotate the page. What I've been doing is setting up a sort of structure that if you click on this button, you get the first draft of the first chapter. If you go to the next button to the right, you get the second draft of that chapter. Third draft. If you go down in a column, you get the next chapter that he wrote.
Oh, wow.
So you get this pattern. If you go across it one way, you get chapter by chapter the sequence in which he wrote the book. If you go down the other column, you get each version of the book, each chapter. If you want to just look at the first chapter, you get each version in order. So when they're done with this, when we've got it all sorted out, and we're pretty close to done now, you'll be able to call up the screen, pick the version of the chapter you want to look at it in great detail, open up another screen, compare. Not sure if I'm describing it clearly enough, but
It sounds amazing. And
it's going
do
to
you
be
have like,
really easy to navigate from one very specific text to another very specific text, or to
is
screen.
it, do you have like a name for this project?
Um, I don't think we have a name for it. We've been referring to it as the tree because the tree grows organically and it sends out shoots and branches.
Well, I think for a Tolkien project, the tree makes a lot of sense.
But it's fascinating. It's like you take a simple thing like the King's letter. At the very end of the book, Aragorn writes. They get a letter that Aragorn the King has written to Sam.
Yeah.
But it turns out there are 4 drafts of that letter because Tolkien never did anything once. And it's like I look at these 4 drafts. Which is the first? Which is the second? Which is the third? Which is the fourth? So you'll be able to click on, open up, compare once we get it all sorted out.
That sounds awesome. And do you think that this is, I've gotten a chance to talk with um, some uh, some digital philologists,
Right.
and do you think that this is where scholarship is going to sort of make to sort of like digify, or I don't know the correct term, but to essentially make all of these manuscripts electronic, so that people can access them and they don't have to go to the Bodleian or the Marquette, for
I
example?
think it varies by the project. An author like Tolkien, a lot of people want to consult the manuscripts. So there's a lot of wear and tear. So there's the impetus of let's, instead of having them deal with the original pages, which are fairly old by now, let's let them look at it electronically. There are other authors that people don't refer to as often that there's no real push to get it scanned. It's just that if once it is scanned, it's more accessible on site and off site. It would be wonderful to have the day when there's more things available, more things readily available. But it's a big job. It's a lot of scanning and a
Yeah.
lot of sorting and organizing. So I think it will happen with the people there's a demand for it. If you do all of Tolkien, there are people that want to see all of Tolkien.
Right.
If you do all of another author from his time, there may not be the same demand. If I were to do it with Dunsany, I know that I like Dunsany, but there are fewer people interested in the complete Dunsany than the complete Tolkien.
Well, see, I've had this conversation with several people about just getting. I tend to drive a lot, and so I would love to see, all of the books that I've talked about in my interviews from the various people that I've mentioned. I would love to see audiobooks.
Yes.
From Tom Shippey's books to Verlin's essays to your history of the Hobbit. Like, I would love to have like a Tolkien collection, like a scholarly collection of audiobooks.
And
I
I'd
just
like for the rest of Tolkien, not all of Tolkien is available as audiobooks. I would really love to see more like The Fall of Arthur as an audiobook.
Yeah.
Some of the last few books Christopher Tolkien did. But you're right, the books about Verlin's book, Shippey's book, there's a lot of good stuff that would be nice to have on audiobook. I think there is a demand that bit by bit it does get out there. Bit by bit we will get more of it.
Yeah.
Well, I hope your campaign goes well. It sounds like you've got a really interesting setup for
Thank you.
that.
Well, so we're almost finished with this one, and what comes next for me, we kind of rebranded because I have other stories that I want to tell after this one, and so I'll be kind of stepping away from Tolkien, and stepping into Symbia. If you're familiar with the far east of the Sword Coast, Symbia was left as like a dungeon master's playground.
Ah,
Um, and there was, so not a huge amount has been written about it. There are several novels that Paul S. Kemp wrote about Erebus Kale.
is this
And
in Forgotten Realms?
it is,
Okay.
yeah. And so I'll be the next after the last battle. The next 50 episodes will be about a story that happens after the Godborn novel in around 1491 DR. So
That'll be a very different campaign.
it sure will. Yeah. Yeah. Well, John, thank you so much for coming tonight.
All right. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. Keep up the good work.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Though this marks the end of the episode, the road goes ever on. Until next time, join us at longwinded.one and consider giving us a review on Apple Music, Spotify, or really whichever platform you choose.